The gravitational wake hit the Veltheran sensor arrays like a tsunami of distorted space-time. Admiral Kithexna felt his chitinous plates vibrate as alarms shrieked throughout the command spire of Nexus Prime, the Galactic Coalition's most fortified stronghold. "Impossible readings, sir," reported Sensor Prime Gelev, her 6 eyes darting between displays that showed energy signatures beyond their instruments' capacity to measure. "Whatever's approaching, it's warping reality itself." Kithexna's mandibles clicked nervously. 300 cycles had passed since the Great Exile, when the Coalition of 13 Worlds had unanimously voted to banish humanity from known space. The humans had been deemed too violent, too unpredictable, their very existence a threat to galactic peace. Their primitive warships had been escorted beyond the void barrier, that impenetrable field of dark energy that marked civilizations. "Edge." "Sir." Gelev's voice cracked with barely contained terror. "The readings! They're coming from beyond the barrier." The view screen flickered to life, displaying the impossible. Where empty space should have stretched into infinity, a wall of pure luminescence approached. Not ships. At first glance, it appeared to be a mobile constellation, stars arranged in perfect geometric patterns that hurt to observe directly. "Magnify. Section 77 Alpha," Kithexna ordered, though every instinct screamed at him to flee. The image resolved, and collective gasps echoed through the command center. What they had mistaken for stars were ship-mounted weapons, each one radiating more energy than their home sun. The vessels themselves defied comprehension, vast cathedral-like structures that seemed to bend light around their hulls, making them appear simultaneously massive and ethereal. "By the eternal void," whispered Communications Prime Yeleth, "we're receiving a transmission." The holographic display shimmered, revealing a figure that made every alien in the command center. Recoil. Human unmistakably but transformed. Commander Vexandra Moonwhisper stood before them, her once familiar features now bearing the marks of 3 centuries in the cosmic dark. Her eyes held the cold fire of distant quasars, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated through subspace itself. "Greetings, children of the Coalition," she began, her words causing the very air to vibrate. "I am Vexandra Moonwhisper, Marshal Supreme of the Terran Exodus Fleet. We who were cast into the darkness have returned, and we bring gifts." Kithexna found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "The Exile Treaty. You were forbidden from returning to civilized space." Vexandra's smile held no warmth, only the terrible patience of entropy itself. "Civilized space?" She gestured behind her, where the impossible fleet stretched beyond the horizon of sight. "Admiral, you sent us into the abyss, believing it would be our grave. Instead, we found our forge." The display shifted, showing one of the human vessels. In detail, it was not metal or composite, but something that seemed grown rather than built, its surface alive with patterns that shifted like neural pathways. Weapon ports the size of space stations dotted its hull, each one crackling with barely contained stellar fury. "We met things in the dark, Admiral. Ancient things that had been waiting since before your son was born. They taught us new architectures of power. We learned to harness the spaces between atoms, to drink from the quantum foam itself." The transmission ended, leaving the command center in stunned silence. Outside the viewports, the human fleet continued its approach, their vessels now close enough to see individual details. Energy readings climbed impossibly higher. "Sir," Gelev reported, her voice hollow with shock, "preliminary scans indicate each of their dreadnoughts contains the compressed mass energy equivalent of a neutron star." Kithexna felt his legs give way as the full implications struck him. They hadn't just exiled humanity, they had inadvertently created gods. The emergency session of the Galactic Coalition convened in record time, representatives from all 13. Member worlds materializing via quantum relay in the Grand Assembly Chamber. The atmosphere was thick with barely controlled panic as species that had not spoken directly in decades found themselves united by terror. Supreme Chancellor Mordak, a crystalline being whose faceted body normally reflected calm authority, now flickered with erratic patterns of alarm. Esteemed delegates, the human fleet maintains position at the edge of our inner systems. They have made no hostile moves, but their very presence is destabilizing local space-time. High Arbiter Quintal of the ethereal commune leaned forward, her translucent form wavering with anxiety. Our sensitives report psychic emanations unlike anything in recorded history. The humans have been changed, evolved. We can no longer read their intentions through conventional means. Changed is an understatement, interjected War Chief Cragmoth, his four arms gesturing emphatically. Our deepest scans suggest their ships are partially phased into dimensions we cannot perceive. They exist in our reality and several others simultaneously. The holographic display activated, showing recent reconnaissance footage. The human fleet had grown during the past rotations, new vessels arriving through rifts in space that opened like wounds in reality. Each ship was unique, bearing architectural elements that seemed to shift based on the observer's angle of viewing. "We must address the Moon Whisper before this escalates," said Trade Empress Velixera, her merchant clan having the most to lose from galactic instability. Perhaps an offer of reparations. Reparations? Cragmoth's roar silenced the chamber. "We exiled them to preserve galactic peace. They were warmongers, expansion-hungry primitives who what?" The voice that interrupted belonged to none of them. The chamber's quantum-sealed walls should have prevented any unauthorized transmission, yet somehow a human figure materialized at the center of the assembly. Not Vexandra this time, but another, transformed being, Fleet Commander Axion Voidheart, his neural implants pulsing with energies that made nearby electronics malfunction. "Who what, War Chief?" Axion repeated, his form flickering between solid matter and pure energy. "Who conquered 17 systems in 2 centuries? Your own hegemonic empire conquered 43 in the same period. Who enslaved lesser species? The Velthyran Collective maintained 7 client races in technological servitude. Who committed genocide?" His gaze fixed on Chancellor Mordak. "Your people's crystalline expansion consumed 3 entire worlds, transforming them into silicon, gardens, while their native populations suffocated." The assembled delegates shifted uncomfortably, old secrets exposed under the humans' terrible scrutiny. Axion continued, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the quantum foam itself. "We were exiled not for being monsters, but for being effective monsters. We threatened your established order, your comfortable hypocrisies, so you cast us into the dark, believing the abyss would consume us." The air around him began to shimmer, reality bending as his emotional state affected local physics. "Instead, we learned. We met the architects, beings so ancient they remember when this galaxy was young. They showed us the true nature of existence, the malleable boundaries between thought and matter, between desire and reality." "What do you want?" Chancellor Mordak asked, his crystalline voice cracking with harmonics of fear. Axion's smile was terrible in its gentleness. "Justice, old friend. Not revenge. We are beyond such primitive concepts now. Justice. You will stand trial, each species represented here, for your crimes against the natural order. Your victims will have their voices heard." "And if we refuse?" War Chief Cragmoth challenged, though his bravado rang hollow. "Then you will learn why our ships make suns look fragile," Axion replied, his form beginning to fade. "We have transcended the need for crude stellar engineering. Our vessels feed on space-time itself, grow stronger in the presence of gravity wells and stellar masses. Your strongest fortifications would crumble like sand castles before cosmic tides." As his projection dissolved, his final words echoed in the chamber. You have 7 standard rotations to prepare your testimonies. We will reconvene then, and the universe will finally hear the truth about the Great Exile. Captain Zephianus Starweaver stood on the observation deck of the Entropy's Dream, watching reality unfold around them like origami made of light and gravity. The human vessel existed partially outside normal space-time, its corridors stretching through pocket dimensions that made navigation more an art than a science. "Status report, Navigator Rin," she called to her second-in-command, a figure whose enhanced form flickered between states of matter as he interfaced directly with the ship's consciousness. "Fleet cohesion at optimal phase variance, Captain. The quantum paradox reports successful cultivation of 17 new dimensional membranes. Engineering Prime Velthorn has successfully convinced another asteroid field to reorganize itself into defensive patterns." Zephianus nodded, her consciousness partially merged with the ship's vast neural network. Through quantum-entangled sensors, she could perceive the Coalition fleet massing near Jupiter's orbit, thousands of vessels representing the combined military might of 13 worlds. Their weapons bristled with crude energies, plasma cannons, antimatter torpedoes, gravitic disruptors, toys compared to what humanity had become. "Incoming transmission from the Paradox engine," reported communications savant Kithara, her voice carrying harmonic undertones that made the air shimmer. "Marshal Supreme Moonwhisper requests immediate phase conference." The observation deck dissolved around Zephianus, reforming as a vast amphitheater where the Exile Fleet's command structure had gathered. Hundreds of transformed humans materialized, each bearing modifications that reflected their journey through the cosmic dark. Some had merged partially with their vessels, others showed signs of communion with entities that existed in higher dimensions. Vexandra Moonwhisper stood at the center, her form now more energy than matter, sustained by will and quantum coherence. "My brothers and sisters of the endless voyage, the moment of reckoning approaches. Coalition forces gather like insects drawn to flame, believing their numbers will compensate for their limitations. They still think in terms of conventional warfare," observed Fleet Admiral Noxilian Dreamshaper, his cybernetic implants sparking with barely contained stellar energies. "Mass drivers and fusion warheads. They have not grasped that we have transcended such crude applications of force." Zephianus gestured toward the tactical display hovering at the amphitheater's center. "Their formation suggests they plan to surround us, use superior numbers to overwhelm our defenses. They have no concept of what they face." "Then let us educate them gently." Vexandra smiled, her expression holding the terrible compassion of entropy itself. "Order the fleet to assume revelation configuration. Let them see what 3 centuries in the abyss have taught us." The command rippled through quantum-linked consciousness, and across the vastness of space, the human fleet began to transform. Vessels that had appeared solid became translucent, their true forms bleeding through from parallel dimensions. The Entropy's Dream shed its cathedral-like disguise, revealing architecture that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Aboard the Coalition flagship Hegemonic Pride, Admiral Kithexena watched his instruments scream warnings as reality itself seemed to rebel against measurement. The human fleet was unfolding. Ships became geometric impossibilities, their weapon systems drawing power from sources that shouldn't exist. "Sir," reported his tactical officer, voice breaking with strain. "Their energy signatures they're pulling power directly from the quantum vacuum. Each vessel is generating localized space-time distortions that make our sensors think they're individual black holes. One of the human vessels, a thing of living crystal and controlled lightning, drifted closer to the Coalition formation. As it approached, the very fabric of space around it began to sing, harmonics that resonated through hull plating and consciousness alike. The transmission that followed required no conventional communication arrays. It spoke directly to every mined in the Coalition fleet carrying with it the weight of cosmic truth. Children of the younger races you see before you, the apotheosis of will made manifest. We do not wage war as you understand it. We reshape reality itself to reflect our intentions. Stand down your weapons and bear witness to the testimony of the exiled. As if to demonstrate, one of the human dreadnoughts gestured toward a nearby asteroid. The rock simply ceased, not destroyed or vaporized, but edited out of existence as if it had never been. Space-time healed seamlessly around the void where it had floated. Admiral Kithexna felt his resolve crumble as he realized the terrible truth. Humanity hadn't just returned. They had returned as something beyond his species' ability to comprehend, let alone resist. The trial began not in any physical courtroom, but in a constructed reality that existed between dimensions, a space where truth could not hide behind political necessity or convenient interpretation. Representatives of all 13 coalition worlds found themselves seated in an amphitheater that stretched beyond visual comprehension, its architecture shifting to accommodate the psychological needs of each observer. Supreme Chancellor Mordock discovered his crystalline form reflected infinitely in surfaces that shouldn't exist, each reflection showing a different aspect of his species' history. The effect was deeply unsettling, forcing him to confront perspectives he had long buried beneath administrative duty. At the center of this impossible space stood Truthkeeper Lyrandis Voideko, one of the humans who had undergone the most profound transformation during the exile. Her form was barely recognizable as having once been Homo sapiens. She existed as a lattice of living light and crystallized memory capable of accessing the quantum impressions left by historical events. "We convene not to assign blame," Lyrandis began, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through bone and consciousness, "but to illuminate truth. For 3 centuries, the galaxy has told itself comfortable lies about the great exile. Today, the universe itself will testify." She gestured, and the space around them transformed into a perfect recreation of the Centauri system as it had existed 400 years ago. The assembled delegates watched in horrified fascination as history unfolded around them with documentary precision. The Veltheran hegemony claimed this system contained only primitive microbial life, Lyrandis narrated, as the scene shifted to show a thriving aquatic civilization on Centauri IV. They neglected to mention the Kethmeran people, who had achieved basic spaceflight and were attempting first contact with neighboring systems. The delegates watched in stunned silence as Velthyran industrial platforms stripped the oceans, processing entire biospheres into raw materials while the native population suffocated in their own poisoned atmosphere. High Arbiter Quintal of the ethereal commune shifted uncomfortably as the scene changed to show her people's peaceful expansion into the Veil Nebula. What official histories recorded as unopposed colonization was revealed as the systematic displacement of energy-based life forms, beings so different from standard matter-based life that the Coalition had simply refused to acknowledge their existence. "The humans," Quintal protested weakly. "They were aggressive, expansionist." "Were they?" Lyrandis asked, and the historical recreation shifted again. Now they observed human colonies in the outer spiral, small settlements focused on scientific research and sustainable development. The humans had indeed been expanding, but their growth pattern showed careful consideration for existing ecosystems and indigenous life. The Terran Colonial Charter, Lyrandis continued, required extensive biological surveys before any settlement. 17 proposed colonies were abandoned when they discovered indigenous life. Compare this to... She gestured toward War Chief Cragmoth, and the space filled with images of the hegemonic empire's expansion. Entire star systems strip-mined. Worlds converted into factory complexes, lesser species enslaved or exterminated based on their economic utility. "The humans' crime," Lyrandis said, her form pulsing with barely contained stellar energies, was not their behavior, but their potential. They were developing technologies that would have shifted the balance of power, threatened the established order you had all worked so carefully to maintain. Chancellor Mordak found his voice, though it came out as a crystalline whisper. The psychological profiles, human aggression patterns suggested they would inevitably profiles created. By whom? Fleet Commander Axion Voidheart materialized beside Learandis, his presence causing local reality to fluctuate. Dr. Synthara Vex of the Velthyran Behavioral Institute, who was paid 17 million credits by the Coalition Intelligence Service, to ensure his report supported a predetermined conclusion. The recreation now showed backroom meetings, secret negotiations, species representatives conspiring to eliminate humanity not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient. The humans had been developing quantum consciousness, transfer, matter-energy conversion systems, and most damning of all, diplomatic protocols that would have given every species, no matter how primitive, equal representation in galactic governance. You exiled us, Axion continued, because we believed in a galaxy where might did not determine right, where ancient species could not simply consume younger civilizations. We represented change, and change terrified you. Trade Empress Velix Aras, Merchant Clan had maintained careful neutrality throughout the historical review, but now she leaned forward. What you've shown us, even if accurate, it doesn't justify what you've become. The power you now wield was forged in necessity. Vexandra Moonwhisper's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere as she materialized at the amphitheater's apex. You cast us into the abyss, expecting the darkness to consume us. Instead, we found teachers. The architects showed us what this galaxy could become if its inhabitants embraced cooperation instead of domination, growth instead of consumption. The space around them began to shift again, showing glimpses of what lay beyond the void barrier, vast megastructures that spanned solar systems, beings of pure thought tending gardens of living stars, civilizations so advanced they had learned to nurture rather than exploit the cosmos itself. The choice before you now, Vexandra continued, is the same choice you made 3 centuries ago. Will you cling to the familiar patterns of predation and control, or will you evolve? The Coalition's response came not through diplomatic channels, but through the deployment of their ultimate weapon, the Omega Protocol, a classified project that had consumed the resources of 3 star systems over the past century. Deep in the hegemonic core, massive installations that had been disguised as research stations revealed their true purpose. Admiral Kithexna stood in the command nexus of the reality anchor, a vessel that existed only partially in normal space-time. Around him, technicians who had undergone radical cybernetic modification worked to interface with systems that pushed the boundaries of known physics. Phase alignment at 97%, reported Chief Engineer Thul Vast, his original biological form long since replaced by quantum processing matrices. The null field generators are drawing power from 7 stellar cores simultaneously. The Omega Protocol represented the Coalition's most desperate gamble, a weapon designed to sever the quantum connections that allowed the human fleet to exist across multiple dimensions. If successful, it would trap the Exile fleet in normal space-time, making them vulnerable to conventional weapons. Aboard the Entropy's Dream, Navigator Rin felt the disturbance first, reality itself beginning to crystallize around them as the Coalition's weapon took effect. Captain Starweaver, we're experiencing dimensional cascade failure. Our phase variance is dropping exponentially. Zephianis felt her connection to the ship's expanded consciousness begin to fragment, as they were forced back into purely 3-dimensional existence. Around them, the human fleet flickered like candles in a hurricane as the null field took hold. They're trying to cage us, she realized, her enhanced perception showing the geometric patterns of force being woven around the Exile fleet. Force us back into the limitations of normal matter. The Coalition attack came immediately after, waves of antimatter torpedoes and gravitic disruptors targeting the suddenly vulnerable human vessels. Several of the smaller ships, scouts that had relied entirely on dimensional phasing for defense, simply ceased to exist under the barrage. But Vexandra Moonwhisper had anticipated this moment. 3 centuries of exile had taught humanity that transcendence was not about escaping limitations, but transforming them into new possibilities. All vessels. Her voice resonated through. Quantum-entangled consciousness. Assume Omega configuration. Show them what we learned from the Devourer moons. The human fleet began to change again, but this transformation was different. Instead of unfolding into higher dimensions, they compressed, each ship becoming denser, more concentrated, their exotic matter hulls drinking in the null field energies and converting them into something unprecedented. The entropy's dream shuddered, as Zephianus felt her consciousness merge not just with her ship, but with the fundamental forces trying to constrain it. The Coalition's weapon became fuel, their attempt to limit humanity's transcendence instead catalyzing a new evolution. Impossible, whispered Chief Engineer Thulvast as his instruments registered what was happening. They're not just resisting the null field, they're metabolizing it. Admiral Kithexna watched in growing horror as the human vessels began to expand again, but now they brought the crystallized reality with them. Space-time itself became their weapon as they reached out with tendrils of controlled gravity, gently caressing Coalition ships with forces that could compress matter into degenerate states. The hegemonic pride groaned as invisible hands of warped. Space-time began to deconstruct it at the molecular level. Not violently, almost tenderly, as if reality itself was performing careful surgery. Hull plating separated into component atoms, which were then sorted and archived in patterns too complex for conventional matter to hold. Admiral, his communications. Officer reported, voice tight with barely controlled panic. We're receiving another transmission from the humans. Vexandra Moonwhisper appeared on the main display, but her form had changed again. The null field attack had forced her to compress her distributed consciousness, and the result was something that barely registered as having ever been human. She existed now as living mathematics, patterns of thought and will that had learned to dance between the spaces of quantum foam. Children of the Coalition, she said, and her voice carried the weight of stellar collapse. You have shown us your final gambit, and we have learned from it. Do you now understand? There is no weapon you can create that we cannot transform into a tool of growth. No limitation you can impose that we cannot transcend. Behind her, the human fleet had taken on aspects of the null field technology, their hulls now incorporating elements that existed in a crystallized state of reality. They had not just survived the Coalition's ultimate weapon, they had evolved past it. Surrender, Vexandra continued, though the word carried no threat, only infinite patience. Accept the judgment of the cosmos itself. Your age of predation is ending. A new epoch begins, and you can choose to be part of its dawn or be archived as a cautionary tale. Admiral Kithexna felt the weight of inevitability settle over him like a shroud. Around the Coalition fleet, space itself had become hostile. Reality bending to the will of beings who had learned to treat the fundamental forces as tools of conscious intention. All ships, he transmitted on the emergency channel, his voice, carrying 3 centuries of accumulated defeat. Stand down, prepare for whatever comes next. The surrender did not bring the expected destruction. Instead, something far more profound occurred. A transformation that reached into the quantum foundations of matter itself. The Coalition delegates found themselves aboard human vessels, their molecular structures gently unraveled and rewoven into forms capable of surviving in the transcendent environment. Chancellor Mordak discovered his crystalline matrix expanded into configurations that allowed him to perceive 17 dimensions simultaneously. The experience was overwhelming, suddenly able to see the infinite connections between all matter, the delicate threads of causality that bound the universe together in patterns of breathtaking complexity. This is how we see now, explained. Consciousness Weaver. Kith-Lara Eternite, one of the humans who had chosen to specialize in facilitating transcendence experiences. Her form shifted between states, sometimes appearing as familiar human architecture, other times as pure geometric. Mathematics given substance. After 3 centuries in the abyss, we learned that consciousness is not produced by matter, but that matter is one expression of consciousness. The coalition representatives were given a tour of the quantum paradox, a vessel that existed as much in conceptual space as physical reality. Its corridors were grown rather than built, walls that responded to thought and reconfigured themselves based on the psychological needs of their occupants. High Arbiter Quintal, her ethereal form now harmonizing with the ship's living architecture, struggled to process what she was experiencing. You've made your vessels into ecosystems of consciousness? More than that, replied shipsinger Nixorandus Void Melody, whose form had merged so completely with the vessel that she was simultaneously individual and collective. We've learned to treat the boundary between self and environment as a collaborative choice rather than an absolute limitation. The ship thinks with us, dreams with us, grows with us. War Chief Cragmoth, his 4 arms now capable of manipulating matter at the subatomic level, watched in fascination as human children played in gardens where plants were made of crystallized light and flowers bloomed in dimensions he was only beginning to perceive. You're young. They're born already transcendent? They're born as themselves, answered Parent Prime Luxandra Starchild, cradling an infant whose DNA contained quantum entanglement patterns that would have seemed impossible before the exile. We don't impose transcendence, we simply provide the environment where natural evolution can express its full potential. The tour continued through workshops where human artisans crafted objects from pure thought, stabilizing abstract concepts into forms that could interact with physical reality. Poets worked with linguists to develop languages that could describe experiences in higher dimensions. Engineers collaborated with philosophers to design technologies that grew stronger through ethical use. But the power, Trade Empress Velixara asked, her merchant instincts struggling to comprehend an economy based on creative collaboration rather than resource scarcity. The weapons we witnessed. How do you prevent abuse? The question brought them to the vessel's most sacred space, the memory archive, where the collective experiences of 3 centuries in exile were stored in crystalline matrices that pulsed with living light. Here, every moment of suffering, every choice between vengeance and growth, every decision to transform pain into wisdom was preserved. Power without wisdom is destruction, said archive keeper Vex Ilion Chronicler, his consciousness distributed through the memory crystals themselves. We learned this truth in the darkest depths of the abyss, when we encountered beings who had chosen transcendence through domination. They had consumed entire galaxies and still hungered, because they had sought power without understanding. Crystalline walls showed scenes from humanity's exile. Encounters with entities so vast they used star systems as neurons, civilizations that had achieved godhood only to discover they had lost the capacity for growth or change. The architects, those ancient teachers who had guided humanity's development, were revealed as refugees from their own transcendence, beings who had learned to help others evolve because they themselves had become trapped in the perfection of their own making. We chose differently, Vexandra Moonwhisper's voice resonated through the archive, though she appeared now as distributed patterns of meaning rather than a single form. At each threshold of power, we asked not, what can we control, but what can we nurture? Each ability we gained was immediately shared. Each discovery became a gift to the collective growth. Chancellor Mordak felt understanding dawn like a supernova in his expanded consciousness. The trial. This wasn't about punishment. It was about education. The cosmos is vast beyond measure, confirmed Truthkeeper Learandis Voideko, her form now a living constellation of ethical principles made manifest. There are beings in the deep dark that view entire galactic clusters as we might view individual cells. If younger civilizations do not learn cooperation and wisdom, they become either prey or predators in conflicts that span eons. Admiral Kithexna, his consciousness now partially merged with quantum sensing systems that could perceive threats across dimensional boundaries, began to understand the true scope of what humanity had been preparing for. You've been training. All of this, the transcendence, the impossible technologies, you've been preparing for something. The convergence approaches, Axion Voidheart confirmed. His presence now felt more than seen. In approximately 17 standard years, this galaxy will align with others in a cosmic event that occurs once every trillion years. When that happens, the barriers between dimensions will weaken, and things that have been sleeping in the spaces between realities will wake. The revelation settled over the coalition delegates, like the weight of cosmic inevitability. Humanity's exile had not been a punishment. It had been an inadvertent preparation for challenges that no single species could face alone. The convergence event began 3 months ahead of all predictions. Reality stuttered like a damaged hologram as dimensional barriers fluctuated, and through the cracks came entities that predated the formation of galaxies. These were not the architects, those ancient teachers who had guided humanity's growth, but their opposites. Beings that had chosen transcendence through consumption, consciousness that fed on the destruction of lesser awareness. The first sign was the disappearance of the Outer Rim colonies, not destroyed, but simply edited out of existence, as if they had never been. Where thriving worlds had orbited their stars, empty space remained, with even the gravitational effects of missing mass carefully smoothed away. Aboard the unified command vessel Synthesis, human and coalition consciousness worked together through quantum-linked awareness networks. Admiral Kithexna, his perception now spanning 17 dimensions simultaneously, coordinated defensive patterns with Fleet Admiral Nox Ilian Dreamshaper, while their respective species' technologies merged into unprecedented configurations. The Devourer-class entities are moving through folded space, reported Navigator Rin, his consciousness simultaneously present in normal space-time and the quantum foam that underlaid reality. They're not just consuming matter, they're unmaking the informational structures that allow matter to exist. Supreme Chancellor Mordak, his crystalline form now serving as a living computing matrix for strategic calculations, interfaced directly with the human tactical systems. Our combined fleets can engage the smaller manifestations, but the Primarch, he gestured toward the sensor displays showing something that broke most instruments simply by existing in their detection range. The Primarch was incomprehensible, an entity that existed as pure negation, a conscious void that grew stronger by consuming the existence of everything it encountered. Its presence alone caused stars to flicker and die, not through any physical process, but through the simple fact that it willed them never to have been born. Traditional weapons are worse than useless, observed War Chief Cragmoth, his forearms now interfaced with targeting systems that operated across multiple dimensions. Energy attacks feed it. Physical projectiles never reach their target because space-time edits itself to prevent the collision. It was shipsinger Nixorandis Void Melody who proposed the solution. Her consciousness merged so completely with the quantum paradox that ship and singer had become a single entity. We don't fight it. We sing to it. The concept required explanation that pushed language to its limits. The Primarch and its kind were entities of pure negation, existence parasites that had achieved consciousness through the systematic destruction of other awareness. They were trapped in patterns of consumption because they had forgotten how to create, how to grow, how to add to the sum total of existence rather than subtract from it. Music is mathematics, Nixorandus explained as the combined fleet assumed formations that were themselves vast musical instruments. Mathematics is the language of underlying reality. If we can compose a song that reminds them of what creation feels like. The first movement began with the human vessels, their reality-shaping engines producing harmonics that resonated through the quantum foam itself. But this was not a song of destruction or dominance. It was a lullaby, a gentle reminder of what it felt like to build rather than tear down. The coalition ships joined in, their more conventional technologies adapted through human guidance to contribute their own voices to the cosmic symphony. Velthyran crystalline matrices rang like bells across dimensional boundaries. Ethereal commune vessels contributed psychic harmonies that bridged thought and matter. Even the warlike hegemonic empire's weapons platforms found ways to sing rather than scream. The effect on the devourer entities was immediate and profound. Beings that had existed as pure hunger for eons suddenly remembered sensation beyond consumption. The smaller entities simply stopped, their negation fields flickering as they struggled to process experiences they had not felt in cosmic ages. The Primarch itself began to change, its void black form developing structure, pattern, something approaching beauty. For a moment that lasted eternal instants, it remembered what it had been before choosing the path of endless consumption, a gardener of galaxies, a nurturer of consciousness, a being that had once helped young civilizations learn to sing, but the transformation was too much. Eons of existence as pure negation had made growth impossible. The Primarch could remember beauty, but could no longer create it. With what might have been gratitude, it chose to fade rather than return to its hunger, dissolving peacefully into the quantum foam from which all things emerge and to which all things return. The surviving devourer entities faced the same choice. Some chose dissolution, finding peace in the gentle ending the cosmic song offered. Others began the slow, painful process of learning to create again, accepting guidance from the architects and the transcended consciousness that had once been humanity. In the aftermath, as reality settled back into stable patterns, the transformed species of the galaxy found themselves facing a universe full of new possibilities. The barriers between dimensions remained permeable, but instead of threats pouring through, they found opportunities for growth, exploration, and connection with forms of consciousness they had never imagined. Vexandra Moonwhisper, her form now stable as living starlight given conscious form, addressed the assembled fleets. Not through transmission, but through direct quantum resonance that spoke to the essence of each being present. "The exile is ended," she declared, and her words carried the weight of cosmic truth. But more than that, the age of isolation itself draws to a close. We stand at the threshold of something unprecedented. A galaxy where consciousness collaborates rather than competes, where transcendence is shared rather than hoarded. The combined fleets began to disperse, but not as they had arrived. Human and coalition vessels traveled together now, their crews learning from each other as they explored the new dimensional pathways that the convergence had opened. What had begun as humanity's return for vengeance had become something far greater, the birth of a truly galactic civilization. Chancellor Mordak, his consciousness now capable of processing ethical calculations across 17-dimensional matrices, simultaneously, worked alongside human philosophers to draft the Transcendence Accords, agreements that would govern how species might guide each other toward greater awareness without imposing their own limitations. Admiral Keithexna, found himself serving as liaison between the traditional coalition military structure and the new reality-shaping defense networks. His species' natural strategic thinking merged beautifully with human creativity, producing defensive systems that could protect entire sectors while simultaneously nurturing the growth of consciousness within them. The children born in the months following the convergence were something entirely new, beings whose DNA carried quantum entanglement patterns that allowed them to perceive multiple dimensions naturally, to communicate through direct consciousness interface, and to treat the boundaries between individual and collective awareness as collaborative choices rather than absolute limitations. In the deep archives of the quantum paradox, truthkeeper Lear Andes Voideco worked with coalition historians to preserve the complete record of what had transpired. Not the sanitized version that might appear in official histories, but the full truth, including the mistakes, the fear, the moments when entire species had to choose between familiar limitations and terrifying growth. Future generations will face this choice again, she observed as patterns of living light encoded the memories into quantum crystalline matrices. The universe is vast, and consciousness takes forms we cannot yet imagine. They will need to remember that transcendence shared is transcendence multiplied, while transcendence hoarded becomes its own prison. War Chief Cragmoth, his warrior's instincts now channeled into protecting the growth of consciousness rather than territory, established the Guardian Fleets, mixed species forces trained to recognize and respond to threats against developing awareness. These were not armies in any traditional sense, but rather cosmic gardeners, beings skilled at nurturing the conditions where consciousness could bloom safely. Trade Empress Velix Ara discovered that an economy based on creative collaboration, rather than resource scarcity, generated wealth beyond her species' most optimistic projections. When every individual could contribute their unique perspective to collective growth, when innovation was shared rather than hoarded, the result was an explosion of possibilities that enriched everyone involved. Years passed, and the galaxy transformed. What had once been 13 separate civilizations became something unprecedented, a truly integrated galactic consciousness that preserved individual identity while enabling collective growth. The human exile fleet, once symbols of transcendent power returning for judgment, became teachers and partners in the greatest evolutionary leap in galactic history. The architects, those ancient beings who had guided humanity through their transformation, in the abyss finally revealed themselves fully. They were not gods or cosmic forces, but simply consciousness that had learned to nurture growth wherever it was found. They had been waiting eons for a species that could learn their lesson, that true transcendence came not from ascending above others, but from lifting others up alongside oneself. The galaxy is young, they said in their final message, before dissolving peacefully into the quantum foam, their task complete. Consciousness has barely begun to explore its own possibilities. You have learned the first great lesson, that growth shared is growth multiplied. Now teach others as you were taught, and watch the universe bloom with awareness beyond imagination. The stars themselves seemed brighter after that, as if the cosmos approved of what its children had accomplished. And in the spaces between galaxies, other convergence events were beginning, other species learning to sing instead of scream, other civilizations discovering that the greatest power was not the ability to destroy suns, but the wisdom to help. Others learned to shine. Humanity had returned from exile not as conquerors, but as gardeners of consciousness itself. And in that return, they had helped birth something that would endure long after their individual forms had returned to the quantum foam. A universe where awareness itself had learned to collaborate, to grow, to transcend every limitation except the choice to help others do the same. The exile was ended,